As I said at the beginning of the presentation, keep in mind that fiscal policy is just one of 5 major categories. And if you look at some of the places like the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World or the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, basically fiscal policy is 20% of a nation's grade. And so just like we're thinking about your GPA, you're flunking history but getting A's everywhere else, your GPA might still be pretty good. And so when you're looking at European countries, you can start with the assumption that, yeah, these places all have very big governments. But now let's look and see, what does it actually mean to their economies? This is, you won't be able to read it, but you don't need to for purposes of what I'm going to tell you here. These are all the countries that are measured by the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index. The blue countries are the most free. The green countries are the somewhat economically free. The yellow countries are sort of the somewhat economically repressed. And the red countries are the really bad ones with a lot of government control and very little economic liberty. And I've circled in red all the European countries. What do you notice? Most of them are in the top category, even though they have some of the biggest governments in the world. And if you look at the second category, you see more European countries. Only 2 European countries, and we're really stretching, like Belarus I'm including as a European country. There's only 2 European countries, Belarus and Bosnia and Herzegovina, that are in the yellow category, and none are in the red category. Even Greece is in the green category, albeit down toward the bottom of the green category. So by global standards, Europe is not a bad place. Now, what's that phrase? Was it Shakespeare who said, damning with faint praise? I don't know. I'm not very cultured and stuff like that. But when I'm looking at this data, I'm not thinking, oh, these countries are great. I'm thinking that they're better than other countries. They have more economic freedom than other countries. They probably all have inadequate levels of economic freedom by my thinking. But again, all I'm doing here is pointing out that Europe as a whole tends to be one of the more economically free parts of the world. Again, more of a condemnation of the rest of the world than it is a celebration of Europe. Now, I did something called that I took this economic freedom of the world data and I created something called the laissez-faire index. And what did I do? I took fiscal policy out of the equation. And then I re-ranked the countries. So in other words, how do they rank on rule of law, property rights, trade policy, regulatory policy, monetary policy? And it turns out that European countries, I mean, heck, Denmark, Netherlands, Switzerland, the UK, Finland, Ireland, Luxembourg, they all rank above the United States. So in terms of economic liberty, not counting fiscal policy, many of these countries do better than the US. And then there's a whole bunch of other European countries that are just behind the United States. So in other words, when you think about, if you're being part of a debate about should the United States be like Europe, you really need to understand, well, in some sense, we already are like Europe, or Europe is like the United States. On issues other than fiscal policy, we tend to be the economically free places in the world. And again, some of them, like especially in Northern Europe, are even more free market than the United States. So what I'm trying to get across to you is that some of these countries have very big governments. I would argue they have very bad fiscal policy. Some of my left-wing friends, oh no, that means they have good fiscal policy. But the real difference between some of the more economically prosperous countries in Europe and the United States is simply they have bigger government, but we tend to be very similar in terms of other economic areas. And indeed, some of those countries are even more free market than the United States when you're looking at issues other than fiscal policy. Here's a chart I did where I looked at all the countries in the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and I put them on a line chart to show the differences among different countries in the world. And you can see Hong Kong, and this was a couple of years ago, but Hong Kong was the very freest, close to 9 out of 10, and Venezuela was the very worst, like about 2.8 out of 10. Cuba and North Korea, by the way, don't get ranked because there's just no data for them. They're such backwards, horrible places. But look at the US, Denmark, France, and Greece. In the grand scheme of things, yes, there's a downward sloping line, but Greece is what, about 6.5, and the United States was, at least back then, we were close to 8. But there's obviously a huge difference between being a country like Venezuela and being Venezuela is much farther away from Greece than Greece is from the United States. So in other words, in terms of looking at the Western world and specifically Western Europe, even the bad countries are not nearly as bad as some of the other places in the world.